everyone. This is Rose Horowitz. I'm a Pulitzer-nominated journalist and the founder of Woman to Follow. Welcome. I'm honored to have you here with me. I'm very excited to introduce my guest, Hagar Chemali, and I'll do that in just a few moments after I just say a few words. We'll be talking about the cost of war here. You know, what will be the impact of the economic, of the war, of Russia's invasion of Ukraine on the US, on Russia, on Ukraine, on the European community, and indirectly on everyone else in the world who'll be affected, other refugee communities. And when we talk about the sanctions, we'll also ask, you know, how tough are these sanctions? Do we have a lot further to go? What other actions might the West take? You know, it's been horrible to see. My last show, I talked to Olga Tokarczuk, who's a journalist in Ukraine, Olga Lautman, who's an analyst, and Monique Camara, who's in Italy. And today we have with us a foreign policy expert who's spent 12 years in the U.S. government. And before I introduce her, I just want to thank my terrific producer, Stefan Kaplan. Thank you so much. And shout out to my sponsor, Women in Technology International. And I was very happy today and honored to speak at a Women's History Month celebration that they held. It was a 2-hour session with lots of women joining from around the world. And we talked about our journeys, our career journeys, and, you know, telling our stories and how best to tell our stories. So tonight, let me welcome Hagar Chemali. She is a foreign policy expert and former spokesperson for the U.S. Treasury Department and the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations under President Obama. Welcome, Hagar. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks so much for having me, Rose. I'm happy to be here.
Thank you. Hagar is a frequent guest on a lot of network shows, and I watch them late at night. And I saw her twice 2 days in a row on Rachel Maddow's show talking about sanctions. And she really explained them. And if Rachel had you back, we know what Rachel did. So I set out to make contact. One of the things we have in common is that we both are graduates of Columbia University School of International and Public Affairs. So very cool. So thank you so much. I'll tell you a little more about Hagar. So in addition to the 12 years she spent in government, including also a stint in the National Security Council as a spokesperson, as a director for Syria and Lebanon, right? Yes. She also has her own show. So she's a video star of a show called Oh My World. And we'll talk about that a little bit. And I think it's nominated for a Shorty Award. So we wish you the best of luck. We'll play a short clip.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Thank you.
Of course. And she also, in her day job, as well as teaching at SIPA, she is the founder and CEO of Greenwich Media Strategies, which is a strategic communications consulting and public affairs company. And let me just tell you where you can find her. You can find her with her name, Hagar Chemali, on Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok. And on Twitter, the handle for her show is Oh My World Show. So check it out. She does a weekly episode.
Thank you. That's right. The show lives on YouTube, so you can go there and subscribe to it too for free, obviously. Thank you so much for giving that a shout out, Rose. I really appreciate it.
Oh, of course. And so let's talk about what's going on. One of the news today that we heard about was that the intelligence community is saying that Putin is living in a shelter, and he doesn't really know what's going on in the Ukraine in terms of both the battle, in terms of the losses that they're sustaining, and even the plan that they've had. And, he's taken some actions that show he's displeased, it seems. So can you talk about that news today?
Yeah, well, one of the things, I wasn't totally surprised when I saw this news, because even when I was in government and I left in 2016, we knew that President Putin was always in a bubble, always in an information bubble, and that he was surrounded by yes men. And so in the run up to this invasion and during the war now, there's been a lot of talk about how not only must he be in this information bubble, but how much that must be affecting his thinking. And it's something that seems to have gotten worse through the pandemic. You see, for example, weird behavior, like he's sitting at the end of 40-foot long tables with everybody else on the other side. And so there seems to be this paranoia that's grown, and this isolation that he's put himself in as well. And that also has furthered this. But as you have with any war, information and the information campaigns and the information war is a big aspect of war in general. And I would say that in the run up to this invasion, the US government did a pretty good job laying out all the intelligence they had, declassifying whatever they could, and putting it right out there as soon as possible. And I think that that played a very big role in uniting nearly the entire world against Russia's aggression. And it is really because we didn't allow Russia to push its propaganda out there in the public very successfully. The only place it's been successful in its propaganda, really, truly, is with a segment of its own population, not even the entire population, just a segment of its population that watches Russian television. So when I saw the news, this intelligence about the fact that he hasn't really been briefed on how bad things are for the Russian military in Ukraine, how many losses there are, how tough of a resistance they're fighting, it's really because his own people fear telling him that, because his policy and his playbook is to react by blaming them and taking action against them. So they don't want to find themselves on the other end of his efforts to detain or jail them or torture them, and or poison and kill them, by the way. So that's why they continue to give him different information or omit other information so that none of them get in trouble.
So you can't speak truth to power in the state.
No, it's really difficult. And I mean, you have to give, that's why I always try to give so much credit to the Russians in Russia who are regularly protesting, who have spoken out, who media officials, media stars and personalities that have come out against this war, protesters who continue to hit the streets. There have been thousands detained. The last number I saw was over 13,000 people who were jailed for protesting alone. And so you have a chunk of the population.
Horrible, what they're,
yeah. Oh.
Yeah. But, I guess when I do speak to other analysts, or I see tweets from Ukrainian journalists, they are often saying it's not just Putin's war, it's the Russians' war. And they point to facts that, they point to stats. I think there was one that came out today, that 60% of Russians do watch the state television and do believe the propaganda, and that it's only some young people or university educated people, and now they have less and less access, as Russia has shut down all media. So you have to go to, I think it's Telegram, right? So how do we read that? How much do they know?
This is going to be a big problem going forward, because even when this war ends, and it will end at some point, even when it ends, you have an entire population of people who do believe what Putin has come out and said, right? That they're fighting Nazis in Ukraine, that they're liberating Ukrainians, that they're bringing them clothes and food and trying to protect them, and they're trying to live off of this World War II legacy. And that's why you do have a large chunk of the population that believes that. And you obviously have a lot of members of the Russian military, by the way, that believe that. And so I've heard numerous anecdotes of Ukrainians saying that, some of whom who have their own family members in Russia who refuse to believe their Ukrainian relatives over what's going on. And I know there are a lot of efforts. For example, I heard one amazing effort by one Ukrainian individual, Ukrainian Russian, who started a website called Papa Believe Me, because of a conversation he had with his own dad. And he found that talking to him as much as possible wasn't changing his mind. The thing that changed his mind, where he started to finally question the Russian government, was because of photographs that his son was sending to him. And so he started this website. And now hopefully that website, I don't know if people can access that website in Russia. President Putin has done a lot, as you said, to create this information vacuum. He has kicked out BBC. He has shut down independent Russian media outlets. He has shut down Instagram. He has significantly restricted Facebook. And one of the things that I learned handling Syria, I handled the first 2 years of the Syria crisis when I was at the National Security Council. And it was so easy to think that given President Assad's behavior and how horrific and criminal it was, that his own elites, his own family members, his own people, his British-born wife would eventually turn against him and say, you know, what are you doing? And how could you do something like this? And it's easy to think that, but it's not the reality. It does not happen. There are always, with dictators, a very large chunk of their own government and their people that do end up supporting what they're doing.
You know, there have been talk about regime change, and, you know, there was all this debate about our president saying, you know, he should not be in power. You know, but, you know, most say, well, there's no, unless you get all the people. I mean, if you read Kasparov, you know, it's unless you get all the people involved, you know, there's not going to be change. And so
Right.
I think the message that I've been getting from, you know, Russians and Ukrainians I've spoken to is, you know, that's why they want to get all this information. And that's, you know, how Zelensky has been, you know, winning this information war, if we want to say that.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I do believe that. Absolutely. If there is anybody winning the information war, I agree that it's President Zelensky. Yes, for sure. And I think that the US government learned a lot of lessons after 2014, when the Russians initially annexed Crimea and were supporting separatists in eastern Ukraine, and they didn't think far in advance to counter President Putin's information propaganda machine back then. And I don't think he necessarily won. I just don't, at the same time, we weren't out ahead enough to ensure that everybody could see, plain and simple, how things were inside Ukraine, that the majority of Crimeans did not necessarily want to go to Russia, right? And these are things that this was something we were constantly fighting when we were in the government. I was spokesperson at the time at Treasury when this happened. And you saw that is a lesson they learned from 2014 that they definitely applied in this case to make sure that whatever they could put out there in the public, they would.
Yeah, it's really amazing, because I think I don't know where I was exactly in 2014, but I don't remember, you know, hearing about it all the time on the news, that this was going to happen, then that it did happen, and what were what are the repercussions, and what is the real story, you know. So we are witnessing something new, I think.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
You know, what are the lessons? What are the most important lessons we should take from the way the war played out in Syria and what we're seeing now?
Oh, I'm so glad you asked me this, because it's something I've shouted out about several times, and sometimes I see lessons being applied, sometimes I don't. But there are many lessons, but one of the most important is that time is not on our side. It's not on the side of the defender. It's on the side of the aggressor. And you can see that President Putin is aware of that, because he's trying to, as much as possible, prolong the negotiations, and he will prolong them as long as he can. Dictators, by nature, they don't enter into something with the option without winning. That's their mind. That's how they enter into something. It's that they can't, winning is not, or losing is not an option. Winning is the only option. So when they're faced with resistance, their thought is not, you know what, let me recalibrate, let me walk it back, and let's be rational about this. It's, I'm gonna lash out. And they'll lash out, and they have no regard for civilian life. They are playing by completely different book of rules, which is that really there are no rules for them, and they don't care about the things that we care about. They don't care about evidence being collected for future possible accountability, being called a war criminal, for example. These are not things that deter or motivate them in any way. They care about winning, and at any cost. They will literally bulldoze an entire country and fight until the last man standing. And knowing that, knowing that that's what they are prepared to do on their end, that they will sacrifice their entire military, the Russians sacrifice their entire military if it means that they can quote unquote win. We have to be prepared on our end to do what we can to end this as quickly as possible, because again, time is not on our side. Dictators don't go anywhere. That's another lesson we learned from Syria. We thought that people would defect and that Assad would fall, and that doesn't happen. He's still there. Not only is he still there, countries have reestablished diplomatic ties with President Assad. It's horrific to see, because we know that the violence was 100% his fault. And so we have to bear that in mind too, that we can't have this false hope that, oh, you know what, people are going to turn against Putin. They're going to see him for who he is. They're going to push him out and put somebody new in. We can't have that kind of hope. Hope is not a policy anyway. So based on all that, what I argue, at least, is that understanding these lessons from Syria, that time is not on our side, that dictators lash out, that they stop at nothing, that even the things that you think won't happen, they do happen. So when people talk about Putin possibly using chemical weapons against Ukrainians, I have no reason to believe he wouldn't do that. He sees no red line against that, not only because he has no regard for civilian life, but because the US government didn't do anything when President Assad used chemical weapons against his people, and it was confirmed. So, and because he's not going to fall in the future, because of all those things, because the UN will not come to save anyone. Another lesson we learned from Syria. Given all that, we have to do what we can to end it quickly. And in my opinion, the only way you can end it quickly is to give, without causing a World War III, is to give President Zelensky all the military equipment he is asking for, and make sure that that military might is so incredibly strong, coupled with really robust diplomatic negotiations. And so there are these diplomatic negotiations, which are great. I would love to see more countries involved that are trusted on both sides. I understand that the US and France and all of us and the UK can't just go in there, but Israel, for example, could go in there. I mean, there are other countries that are friends with both that could go in there and apply even more pressure to get those negotiations done.
So would you see Turkey joined by Israel, or Israel, or another country than Turkey leading those negotiations?
Well, Turkey they've already so quickly carved themselves this role to play as mediator for both. So they're already taking place in Turkey, and Turkey has this role. I should caveat that I usually don't trust the Turkish government as far as I can throw them. But in this, and I still don't trust them. However, I will say that they are actively friends with both. They are actively supporting both. They've given aid to Ukraine, and they maintain this relationship with Russia. They've also, by the way, I should add, they've also said very publicly that they welcome Russian oligarch assets and money to come to Turkey, since they are not welcome around the world. Now, at the same time, by the way, it isn't
ships, I assume, ships and
yeah,
ships,
I mean, it isn't exactly a lucrative move for any Russian oligarch to convert his money from US dollars or euros to the Turkish lira. The Turkish lira is not exactly a strong currency, but that said, I don't think it's not a good look for Turkey to be moderating these talks and at the same time look opportunistic in terms of Russian oligarch investments. But that's neither here nor there. That's a separate issue. But that said, Turkey has already established itself as a mediator in this. When I was in government, when we had problems in Lebanon and problems in Syria, they also tried to do the same thing. They can be helpful a little bit in these roles, but I never saw them ever complete negotiations to reach a solution. That's why I say that while it's great that they've started this and that they're hosting and that they're pushing it along, that's why I believe you need some other countries to really get in there and and apply even more pressure. And the main one I can think of, honestly, I don't think there are that many, but the main one I think of is Israel.
Okay. And any role for the United Nations?
Oh, that's I'm glad you mentioned that.
You work there. I mean, you work for the U.S. ambassador, so.
You would assume that I would have thought that the UN Secretary General should 100% play a significant role in these talks. I don't know what he's doing. I don't know that most of us know what he's doing. I know he put out a statement today saying that there have never been more conflicts around the world. And while I appreciate his ability to count, that's not that helpful in bringing an end to the conflicts, which is technically his job. And I mean, you can sense my snarkiness here and my real deep disappointment in his role as Secretary General. I know that there's a lot at the UN that is not his fault. He did not create the system of the United Nations where you have a Security Council that has Russia, the aggressor, as having a veto power, and therefore the Security Council is completely impotent, because any power that comes from the UN comes from the Security Council. So they're not going to be able to impose sanctions that are multilateral. They're not going to be calling for a peacekeeping force. Well, I wouldn't advise a peacekeeping force now, by the way, until there's a peace to keep. But even in the future, they may not allow that. So the system is in and of itself broken. But the fact of the matter is that the job of the Secretary General is to make sure the UN is meeting its mission of upholding international peace and security. And so his job number one should have been, when he came to office, to push the reforms that have been discussed for over 20 years and to work with nations to try and implement some meaningful reform. But the reason nobody does that is because it doesn't serve them. Meaningful reform would mean that he would have less power, not that he has much now, that each veto wielding power and country in the Security Council would also have less power, that they would share that with other members. That's why there's no movement at the UN. The one thing I will say that surprised me is that he does have the power to force himself into these negotiations. The reason that he is so silent on publicly criticizing dictatorships like the Russian one, like the Syrian one, by the way, the reason he's so silent about that is because he views that as he doesn't want to undermine the relationship with those countries in case he needs to mediate conflicts or negotiate with them. And so the thing that I can't understand is, well, okay, you've spent all this time not criticizing Russia publicly, so use your chits now. Now's the time to cash that in. What are you doing sitting on your hands in New York? It drives me up the wall. Sorry.
No, I think you did point to the fact that since we can't, there's nothing we can do right now about the Security Council, what happens there, that the U.S. ambassador to the UN did try to push through getting as many countries to to speak out against what was happening.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, she said in the latest Security Council meeting, she lamented how feckless the Security Council is, how useless it is, how it is nothing but an exercise in political theater, and that they now have to rely on the UN General Assembly to pass any kind of resolutions, which is great, by the way, that the UN General Assembly came out with a resolution where 141 countries, this was 3 weeks ago, where 141 countries condemned Russia's aggression. That is a lot in the world of the UN. And so at the very least, it shows how united the world is on this issue. But the UN General Assembly has no power of any kind. They can't do anything with that condemnation. The one thing I will say that the UN excels at is working on the ground. So they are very quick to get in places and get food to people and build refugee camps and so on. So, and they are doing that, of course, but that really is, in my experience, having worked at the UN, it is a very different baby than the UN Secretariat sitting in New York City.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Can you give us a picture of where you think we are now with sanctions in terms of, some people question, okay, well, there are, 7 banks we have sanctions against, and that are, I think, are prohibited through, to work through the SWIFT system. So can you, and that there are still 5 who are able to operate. So what is the distinction between, let's say, those 7 and those 5? And do you think there'll be more Russian banks that are named and targeted for the SWIFT system?
For SWIFT. So we'll start, so on SWIFT specifically.
Yes.
And for anybody watching, and if you don't already know, SWIFT is kind of like the WhatsApp for financial messaging. And that is a term I stole from one of my colleagues at the Atlantic Council, by the way, Julia Friedlander. She's awesome.
I haven't heard that yet.
Yeah, she came up with that. I can't take credit for that. She came up with that. I loved it because that is what it is. It is a secure messaging system. And the vast majority of banks all over the world and financial institutions use that system in order to get secure messaging related to every financial transaction. So if a bank in the UAE is sending money here to the United States, the message for where that money came from, who the originator is or beneficiary, what the money is supposed to do once it gets to New York, who it's going to, all those details. That's what SWIFT does, is explain those details in a very secure way. So if you're cut off from the SWIFT system, it's almost impossible, if not completely impossible, for you as a financial institution to do business with anyone else on the outside. And so the banks that they've targeted are, and this is the case, by the way, not just for SWIFT, but for the US sanctions and European sanctions against the Russian banks that they've chosen. They've deliberately chosen banks that are directly involved in propping up Putin's regime, in financing its military, and ultimately these are banks that would find ways to help finance Putin's violence machine. And so you have banks, for example, that focus on fundraising and financing. You have a bank that specializes in the defense sector. You have another one that specializes in the tech sector, another bank that props up the Russian oligarchs. These are the banks they've targeted. They've deliberately Treasury, at least, and along with the Europeans, and the unity here has been amazing, by the way. They've deliberately not targeted banks, in particular banks that provide services for retailers in Russia, for the broader Russian population, for stores and businesses like pharmacies and supermarkets and so on, because those are not the right banks to target. That would be that would actively be hurting the broader Russian population. And that's certainly not the message that Treasury or the Europeans want to pursue. So could you see more? Sure. You could always see more, especially when the negative actors that we've been going after in Russia, if they end up moving all their business to the banks that are not sanctioned, then those banks are going to end up getting are going to be vulnerable to sanctions. Yes, for sure.
And I think you talked about that even the sanctions that don't involve those banks, so the SWIFT, those banks are not cut off from the SWIFT system, are affected because the value of the ruble has, decreased.
Oh, completely. So let's take a step back. We'll take a step back a little bit about, the ruble and what this means. And so in general, when Treasury, and I can speak for Treasury just because I was on the inside for so long, they have numerous analysts, when they pursue and prepare these sanctions packages. Their whole goal is to target the nefarious actor, the actor pursuing sanctionable behavior, and to disrupt and dismantle all of their financial networks with a clear foreign policy or national security objective in mind. And so in this case, obviously, the national security and policy objective is to undermine Putin's military offensive, to get him to stop the violence, and to disrupt and dismantle all the financial avenues that Putin could use and the military could use to further their objectionable behavior. And so they analyze, what can we target to make it harder, costlier, and riskier for these actors to pursue their operations? And how can we do that while trying to limit as much as feasibly as possible collateral damage on the broader population? When you take actions, though, that hit the currency, it's inevitably going to have an effect on the broader population. And the move that they took the US and Europe that affected the rubles most significantly. All of it affected the ruble, by the way, but the one that really hit hard was the move they took to prevent Russia from accessing its foreign reserves in the United States and in Europe. That totals up to about a third of its foreign reserves. They have over 6% here in the United States in the US dollar. They have over 20%, 25%, something like that in Europe, in different countries, in France, in the UK, and so on. And the move that the Treasury Department did, by the way, this is a very significant move. It is unprecedented. We have
Never
sanctioned
before.
No, yeah, I mean, we've sanctioned central banks before, but those central banks were already very isolated. So, like, for example, the Syrian central bank, the central bank of Iran, the central bank of Venezuela, these are banks that were very isolated, that didn't have assets here in the United States, or in Europe at least. So when we sanctioned them, it was really more about isolating the country even further, and encouraging other countries to do the same thing, or to just not do business with the country. It's another thing when a country has active assets in your own country, which is usually something you want, and because it helps your own economy, and you're taking steps to prevent them from getting at it. And so that's why, by the way, that's why we didn't sanction the Central Bank of Russia. What they did was impose a regulation on US financial institutions, prohibiting them from engaging in financial transactions with the central bank. So just because of that regulation, the central bank cannot access its foreign reserves. If they can't access those foreign reserves, then they can't use that money to finance its military and to prop up the ruble. And that was one of the biggest things that affected the ruble for sure.
Thank you. Giving us a great lesson here. One of the things that I did notice, and I'll just ask you this, and I want to get to some of the comments and questions we have from our viewers, is that one of the impacts I think I read was that Russia, in a certain tank, they could no longer have a certain part. They needed to make that tank. And so, just to give us an example of the way this did work to harm, Russia's military might.
I'm so glad you mentioned it, because one of the things that, and I'm sure you saw this from all the times I've been on air explaining this, which is I keep getting asked this question of, sanctions did nothing to deter Putin. And so how can you argue that sanctions work? And clearly they didn't work, because we've been threatening them and Putin went ahead anyway. And as a sanctions person, somebody who worked in it a long time, and President Biden said this himself, though I do think that the US government at the time that they were threatening sanctions could have been a bit clearer about this, which is that sanctions are, first of all, they're not the silver bullet, and they never were. Nobody expects them to change behavior entirely. They work over time, and they try to find the Treasury Department, at least when they craft their sanctions regime. And a sanctions regime is basically, it means a whole host of sanctions that you have targeting one bad actor. So you have Russia's sanctions regime, the Syria sanctions regime, Iran, North Korea, so on. So when it comes to Russia, they are clearly looking at every single angle that could prop up Putin's regime and the military. And that is why they've gone after the oligarchs and Putin himself. That's why they have gone after the defense sector and the banks that help the defense sector. That's why they've gone after Russia's oil, because that's 30% of Russia's economy. That's at least on the US side for now. So all of those, they're going at this from every angle that they can. And technology and components and parts is a big piece of this, because people sometimes don't realize how many parts are, not just how many parts are made in the United States, but how any kind of machine or technological equipment includes really parts from all over the world. And so often there will be a piece of technology, software, a part that comes from the United States. And so when we prohibit those exports to Russia, it genuinely has an effect on their logistical ability and their infrastructure to support their war machine. And that is a perfect example of it, is the fact that, as reports have said, that they're unable to repair or create new tanks. Another example of this that we've seen that hasn't been confirmed, but this is what I analyzed from it, is that China refused to send airplane parts to Russia. And China never explained why. And, you know,
And this is new. This is since this
no,
since
this is yeah, just like 2-3 weeks ago. So it's since the invasion. Yes, it's since the invasion. But it was before the phone call that President Biden had with President Xi. So before that phone call where President Biden warned China against militarily aiding Russia, China on its own did not send airplane parts to Russia. There could be many reasons for that. And we could analyze that. There could many reasons. It could be that President Xi doesn't want to hitch his tail to Russia's wagon right now. And that's probably part of it. China plays a very long game. It could be because they're afraid to get into the crosshairs of US sanctions. But why would he be afraid to get into the crosshairs of US sanctions? Because it's possible or likely that those airplane parts have a US component. And if they have a US component and he sends it to President Putin, he's automatically in violation of US sanctions and could face repercussions for that. So there could be other reasons as well that led him not to do that. But that is often a reason. Now, I don't have confirmation of that, by the way. I want to clarify. I don't know that the airplane part he didn't send has US parts, but that is a very common a very common repercussion you see from US sanctions. They reverberate all over the world because of the strength of the US dollar, because of how many pieces and parts are made in the United States.
Okay. Let's just take a moment and just want to thank everybody for watching. I think Dave Layton from Witty was watching, and hello to Tim Son, who's watching from Pennsylvania. And Neil Parag, who's watching from Springfield, Virginia, Ann Arriaga, who's watching from Long Island, Paula Kiger, who's watching from Tallahassee, Florida. And let's take a question for you. Paula asks, how does the UN balance all the different balls in the air, humanitarian aid plus the plus the huge security concerns?
Well, it's in part because of this. So first you have the Secretariat in New York City, which is enormous. And the UN itself has all these different offices populated by UN staff, and the UN staff come from all over the world. And each one is tasked with different aspects that the UN is supposed to cover. And the UN's mission is in part to support international peace and security all over the world, number one. Number two, to support human rights, in particular, all over the world. They are failing at that. We'll get to that piece. Really failing at that one. And number three, to create this venue, this place of dialogue where conflict and problems and issues can be mediated and solved, and to support a general global world order, a world order that's been created and put in place since the end of World War II. So you have offices in New York City that are tasked with monitoring these issues, writing reports on these issues, holding conferences and meetings on these issues. And they cover not just the entire world, but then each issue all over the world for each region. So it could be, for example, women's rights all over the world, LGBTQ rights all over the world. It could be clean water all over the world. And
one of the things I learned about was, they have a special doctor in charge of world, listening, world hearing, that comes out with reports about how the world is doing on that. And, so yeah, really.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes. They have investigative teams and accountability teams and in an endless amount of committees and so on. It's a very heavily staffed place. This is the Secretariat in New York City. And you have in New York as well, obviously, you have these bodies, I'm going to call them bodies of the UN, where each member state has a seat. So you have the UN General Assembly, you have the Economic and Social Council, you have, I'm going to mess some of these up. You have the UN Security Council is not all member states. It's 15 states that sit around the table and 5 of whom are permanent members, and those members have a veto power. And those members are Russia, China, the United Kingdom, France, and the United States. And then the other 10 rotate every 2 years. So, okay, so this is the UN and how it's set up in general. And then you have these different divisions of the United Nations, each of which are tasked with handling different issues altogether. So you have UN Women, for example, and they focus solely on women and women's rights and women in peace and security all over the world. You have the UN Environment Program that focuses on climate change and the environment and environmental issues all over the world. You have UNICEF. Obviously, I'm sure you know that one, the UN Children's Fund. You have the UNDP, UN Development Program, the UNRWA, the UN Refugee Works Agency. So, I mean, we could go on. There are many of these. And that's why when I said earlier that I like to separate out those divisions or bureaus or offices, because those offices tend to do work in the field, abroad, all over the world, and they get in on the ground and they get their hands dirty and they do some really, really good work. The Secretariat in New York honestly often feels like a lot of reports, a lot of elbow rubbing, a lot of talk. And so while they do cover everything and they monitor it, it doesn't necessarily mean that they act on it very successfully. And a lot of that is just the system of the UN. So one of the things I often say is that my own opinion is that we need the UN. We need it more than ever. But I feel like the system needs to be burnt to the ground and rebuilt.
Okay. That's a very comprehensive answer. And let's hope. I long ago was an intern at the UN. UNDP, and I did a report on the role of women at the UN. So, yeah. So anyway, I didn't decide to go into the UN, but yeah.
That's what happened to me. By the way, I interned at the UN in grad school, thinking this is where I want to be. I want to solve conflicts and support peacekeeping. And it took a few months for me to realize that the UN was nothing but reports, and I wanted to affect change for the better. And that's how I landed at the US government.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, we have yet to see a woman U.S. Secretary General. So
that's true. Yes. Long overdue. Yes.
So if we can, there's just to show people, there's a woman, Maria, if I see her name, I will know how to pronounce it, who has been showing videos every day of the destruction that we've, in the Ukraine. And I think we have a video just to share that with.
This is Maria Avdeeva from Kharkiv, Ukraine, and I am now at the district which is called Saltivka, residential area in Kharkiv on the outskirts of the city. This area was under constant shelling and bombardment by Russian troops since the beginning of the war, and it is very heavily destroyed. Many houses here, multi-story buildings, are completely in ruins. Others are without the windows. There is almost no one here, no people left because of the constant shell and bombardments, because there is no possibility for people to live here, and they have no places where they will return because their homes are now ruined. And the shelling continues. It doesn't stop day and night. This is very hard to see Kharkiv like this, but everyone here tells me that they know the moment will come. People will return to their homes and rebuild everything. And the life will return to this area, to Saltivka, to Kharkiv, to all other Ukrainian cities which are now being destroyed by Russian troops. Slava Ukraini!
It's just so hard to watch that. I tend to watch the news before bed, and I've been watching Maria and also, Olga Tokaryak, who was in Kyiv and moved to the Western Ukraine in the whole, she has a 6-year-old daughter and she wanted to be safe, but the responsibility of all the people that, we hear, I mean, she said that she felt guilty leaving Kyiv because she had other friends who were journalists who also had children and didn't leave. Mm-hmm. So it's, and that everyone is involved in this effort, whether, in all levels, all parts, and and it seems like it's been a part of the weaponry that Ukraine has brought to this battle, because they have people on the ground telling the troops who's coming, and that it's that the Russians don't have that. It's an advantage that they have, and they're using it very well.
Yeah, Maria's amazing. I've been following her, and I was on BBC with her at one point. She said, for example, she was at the time in her apartment, and there were bombardments happening around her. And she was like, I refuse to leave. This is my city. I'm going to show what's happening. I mean, she's so brave. She's amazing. We're so lucky to have her. And I just hope she stays safe.
Yeah. It's really, the bravery is amazing. I wanted to ask you one more question about the economy, and that is, in the toolkit, what are the things that we could be, what are the things that U.S. government hasn't pulled out yet against Russia that we might see?
Well, it's not going to surprise you that the Treasury and the Commerce Department always maintain a number of options in the hopper that they can always go after. Some of them are stronger than others, of course, but there are still a number of Russian sectors of its economy that have not been targeted yet. And Dileep Singh, who's at the National Security Council, he was on CBS 60 Minutes a couple of weeks ago saying, for example, we still haven't gone after a number of their sectors, and he didn't outline them, but then the parts of their economy that remain that haven't been targeted include things like timber and palladium, platinum, iron, steel, nickel. These are, and obviously if we were to target a number of those sectors, we would want to make sure that there isn't a significant backlash on U.S. and European businesses. And because something, for example, if you're targeting something like aluminum or steel, that's going to have a major effect on manufacturing and jobs and inflation and so on. So as with any kind of sanction, they have to analyze, and if they take any of these types of steps, they have to prepare for them and find other sources, for example, and line those up. And it's trying, but I thought I looked at that as a message as well to President Putin, that we're not afraid to go after those sectors. We're going to be working with Europe on it. And I would just close that with, and I said this earlier, but I don't think I can stress it enough, how remarkable the unity is between the United States and Europe on these sanctions. These are super tough, but it's hard for Europe to impose sanctions. It has always been hard for Europe because for the EU to impose sanctions, it requires the consensus of all 27 member states. And that's hard on any day, but you have one of those countries in particular, Hungary, where the prime minister is quite close to Prime Minister Putin. And yet, Viktor Orban the Prime Minister of Hungary, has been supportive of these sanctions. But perhaps he's changing his mind. I don't know. I can't analyze that. I don't know what he's thinking. Perhaps he's afraid Russia will turn to him next. But that said, that the unity here, you can see that that's a key goal of the Biden administration, that the steps that they're taking, they're trying to do as much as possible with Europe to show no daylight between them as a message to President Putin.
Okay. Well, we will watch your predictions, and thank you. Just to want to talk a little about your show, and so we'll show, just to show everybody, we'll show a brief clip of, I think it's your first show.
Thank you all for coming to Cornwall and to Carbis Bay for the G7. It's been an absolute delight. And thank you to everyone who helped organize this summit and all the people who certainly helped us put the carbs in Carbis Bay. I'll take the first question. Yes, Beth Rigby with Sky News. The lockdown here is taking a long time. How do you feel you've handled the pandemic and vaccine rollout, and when will we be done with lockdown? Well, I don't want to release information in dribs and drabs, but I do want to mention in particular the role of the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine, the world's most popular vaccine, developed right here, given around the world at cost, really, truly the most fabulous vaccine.
So tell us a little bit, why did you start this? And
yes. Oh, God, thank you so much for asking. I love talking about my show. So, first of all, by the way, Boris Johnson is hands down my favorite person to impersonate. I impersonate a lot of world leaders. If anybody has any recommendations for world leaders whom I haven't impersonated that you'd like to see, wigs that you think I really need to buy, let me know. I am open to all of them. But Boris is my favorite. And unfortunately, he's just not really in the news the last month or so, ever since the COVID party thing that came out of the news, how many COVID parties he had. Then I was impersonating him every week, and now it's not so much anymore. But my show, Oh My World, I had this concept a couple years ago, actually. So I launched it in May of 2020, and I had this concept for a show that covered the top world news stories in a really fun and easy way, easy to understand, and in an approach that explains why all these world developments matter to us here in the United States. And I just don't find it explained that way in most news, certainly not on cable news, but in most news networks or channels. It's not explained in an easy way, in an entertaining way, and certainly not in a way that explains to an American viewer why this stuff matters so much, why what happens abroad matters very much here and vice versa. And then a key part, the brand is very mission-based, because I genuinely believe that by exposing all these stories and raising awareness and sharing stories of dictators and human rights abusers, while also lifting up those doing good around the world. That's my crush list, for example. That by raising awareness, you fundamentally affect change for the better. And because I want to get a young generation of people interested in this stuff because it matters. And so that's the concept of the show. So the show itself is 10 minutes or around 10 minutes once a week. It's released every Friday morning. And I usually have about 5 segments or 6 segments on what's going on around the world. It's super short, as you can imagine, for 10 minutes. Each story is only about 1.5 to 2 minutes. I have usually a guest on there, squeezed in there as well. And I do a lot of impersonations because it makes people, if it's funny, usually people like it, it's entertaining, and it can make somebody visualize. And by the way, the thing that people don't sometimes realize about the impersonations is that the vast majority of what I say is not me making it up. Those are actual quotes from the person I'm impersonating. Usually I exaggerate it a little bit, but they are stemming from actual quotes. And so, it's like free content out there. And so I try to make it fun and funny where I can. I use political satire where possible, and otherwise, keep it serious. But the brand is growing, which is exciting. I really appreciate you giving it a shout out and support. Yes. And it's been a fun run. I love doing it.
And do you find that high schools, or teachers are writing to you and saying, hey, we're playing this in our classroom, and because it seems to me, who's been a mother, that it seems a great way to bring truth and this awareness of the world.
Yes. So actually, so I know many teachers have reached out to me to let me know that they shared the show in their classes on a weekly basis. And I've been occasionally to schools, and usually when they do that and they're interested in, then I'll get invited to talk sometimes. So I'll go to the school to talk or whatever, and I'll get, pummeled by students who they'll be like, they'll get starstruck. And I always think that's funny because I'm so not that person, but they're just like, oh my God, it's you. We watch your videos. And they start quoting me back to me. And, and it means the world, because it's real validation of this concept. Or proof of concept that these kids who, especially because they're so young, usually that's the show. When I crafted the show, I crafted it for the age group 18 to 35, but that is the largest audience. But the biggest surprise I had is that it really appeals to people age 9 to 65. And I cannot tell you how many people watch it on a regular basis in that wide age group. But the thing that I thought was such a proof of concept from young kids who are mainly up, 13 to 16, 17, is that these are kids, most of whom really don't know that they want to work in international affairs, that they ever want to work in it, if they want to work in it. That's not why they watch it. And that to me is a big proof of concept, because when I launched this, I had a lot of people telling me, Oh, that's so niche. Like who wants a show just on foreign policy and geopolitics? And and one of the things I kept saying was that if you really learn about the younger generation and how they've been raised on social media, it's very different. They care about this stuff. They care about social good. You know, they are raised. This is a generation raised with threats of climate change and mass shootings, and it's just a very different generation than the one I grew up in. And so it's been amazing to see. But yes, thank you. Schools and teachers, I find, love it in particular.
Okay, well, fascinating, and we will watch what happens. What I'll ask you, maybe because of this show, but what did you want to be when you were 10? Let's say
10.
Did you imagine yourself at the UN? Did you imagine yourself as an actress?
So, it's funny you say that because I always did a lot of drama and acting. I never thought I would be an actress though, but I will say that those skills really helped me for this show. But it's when I was 10 in particular, I do remember that I either wanted to be an astronaut because it just looked so cool, or, and bear with me for a minute, I thought that being a minister would be cool. And the reason I thought it would be cool was only because I wanted to stand up in front of a congregation every week and talk and have all these people just listen to me. It wasn't really for religious reasons at all. Yeah, it was just because I love to talk. Clearly, as you can see, I adore talking. But my interest, believe it or not, in conflict resolution and peacekeeping and international affairs was not short. It was not long after that. It was when I was 14. So when I was 14 years old, a history teacher of mine overheard me talking about Middle Eastern politics in particular. And that's because I was raised hearing about Middle Eastern politics my whole life. I'm born and raised here in Greenwich, Connecticut, but my parents are both from Beirut and they fled the civil war there. And so I always was raised being aware of not just the problems in the Middle East, but the struggles of my own family, the religious discrimination they faced, the exile that they faced at some points. I mean, in my family's history, and so I think being aware of that, I just had this natural interest. And so a history teacher of mine when I was 14 told me he thought I would really enjoy Model UN, and so I joined, and I was hooked from that moment on. And I decided, I got to go to the UN, and I wanna solve conflict, and I want to work in peacekeeping. And that is what I focused on in those types of classes when I went to Barnard for undergrad and then SIPA for graduate school. And it was my second year of my master's where I was interning at the UN in an office called the Department of Political Affairs. And I was on the Iraq team. I was a lowly intern on the Iraq team, and I was preparing daily reports that would go ultimately to the Security Council. And a woman who handled Africa was there, and she was lamenting about the genocide in Darfur that was happening at that time. And I very naively told her, I said, well, why don't you write a report and send it to the Security Council, and everybody can declare genocide, and then legally they were required to act. And thinking I was so smart, with this suggestion. And she told me, she was like, if the US is not going to lead on this, then nobody's going to do anything. And that's when it was that moment that I was like, clearly this place is feckless and I don't want to be here. And I want to go where I can affect change for the better. And so I shifted my entire coursework to focus more on counterterrorism, and then pursued the US government after that.
No, right. And how many languages do you speak?
I speak 4.
Okay.
I was raised speaking English and French at home equally. So I'm native in French and English. English, obviously, I hope, as you can see. And then I speak Arabic and Italian as well.
Oh, well, that's great.
Yeah, I do. I love languages. If I could spend my time studying languages, I would. I would love to learn Spanish and Greek and German. There are many Russian. There are many languages I would love to learn.
Terrific. And do you see, one of the things that I started a Women to Follow Twitter list for women following the Ukraine, because as I watched, anybody that I followed on Twitter who was following, who's covering this as an academic, activist, journalist, you'd go, Twitter tells you the other 10 people you should follow. And the other 10 were 9 out of 10 times men. So the whole idea of, what I'm trying to do is to amplify women's voices. Do you find that that is changing at all in terms of covering and reporting and analyzing, national, international news?
Oh, that's a good question. I'm going to divide this into two a little bit. So when I was in government, when I started in government, it was a very heavily male-dominated world, in particular in national security. That said, my bosses and mentors, who were all men, were incredibly supportive and of me and other women. And they consistently empowered us, consistently pushed us to be at the table and speak up. They themselves would sit out of meetings so that we could go. They were always looking to promote us, women in particular. And by the time I left government, it was a marked change. By the time for, the most of national security and foreign policy, whereas when I started was a minority of women, by the time I left was nearly half female staff and almost half female leadership. So it had made a huge change. And the reason I give this background is because this is the world I was in for 12 years. And I don't think that that's the rule across government, but that was my experience. And it was I think, the experience of a lot of people working in national security in particular, at least my female colleagues with whom I worked. But I didn't feel this sense, actually, of how hard it was to be heard and to be taken seriously until I left government and switched into the media world. And I feel that way till today. It is still a struggle. And it shocks me. I'm not going to call out any networks in particular, but there are a few where, there are a few that I've been on where I'll be like on a panel for an hour, and the entire hour I'm the only woman. The entire hour between the anchor, the panelists, and the guests, I'll be the only woman. And that, I find that stunning in a world like today. And I don't think that that's because I'm one of the rare foreign policy people. I just think it's just tough. And I hope in the media world, I don't think it's changing fast enough, if that's my answer. And maybe I haven't been in it long enough to know how it used to be, because you definitely see a lot of female anchors. I mean, there are a lot of female anchors and reporters.
There are some who have all, for the whole hour have 3 male guests, and no one, and it's a female anchor. But that's not the same as having an expert like you on the show, or and I'm aware of this because as part of my work with this group DigiMentors, a startup, we did 300 shows about different aspects of the pandemic, COVID show. And, we made it a policy never to have an all male panel.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. And, we were but I think you have to be very particular. You have to be very determined and have rules, because otherwise things happen. As a producer, let's say you need 3 guests, and, you just say, okay, here they are. But that's not the way to do it, because we know, as I've been finding out, I have 166 or something on my list. And that's, U.S., Ukraine, UK, they're out there. So
there have been times
all you're doing to get that.
Thank you. There have been times I've been asked to join a panel on air or in person for a conference or whatever, where the person organizing or the booker or whatever will say to me, I really need a woman. Can you join this panel? And sometimes I'm like, how do they not see what they just said to me, that they're only picking me to fill some kind of quota they think they need to achieve, and that it's not to do with my credibility or background or anything. And this is what I mean by the struggle to be taken seriously, when the achievements I've had in government are exactly the same, if not more, as a lot of the male counterparts I'll have on these panels. And I don't understand it. I can't understand it, because I really swear in government and in Washington, I did not face that. I really didn't. To the contrary, really on the contrary.
Yeah.
So,
Well, on that note, I will ask you, who are, I always ask my guests their own woman to follow. I usually ask for 3 because I think it's manageable. So you're welcome to send me more. But who are 3 women that we should know about and follow?
Yes, I love that you asked this question, by the way. And I really honestly, I have 3 off the top of my head. There are so many, but 3 just off the top of my head very quickly are other women who also work in this world of national security, who are always writing intellectual, cool things, smart things, who are also very supportive of other women. By the way, that is a very big thing I look for in my amazing network of women. But so one of them, for example, is Nayera Haq. Nayera is a friend of mine from government days. She was also a spokesperson at the U.S. mission to the UN and at State Department. She is now an anchor on Black News Channel, and she has a show on POTUS, on the POTUS channel on Sirius XM. She's been a huge supporter of mine, and she's super smart. And so I highly recommend Nayera. Yes, Nayera Haq for sure. I don't know this person on here, but I can tell you the others I have.
Okay.
I can tell you the others I have. For example, one of them is a woman named Jasmine El Gamal. We're also in government together. She and I both were worked on the Syria crisis. She was at the Department of Defense at the time that I was at the White House. And she actually is based sometimes in the Middle East and Turkey, right now in London. And she does amazing work in analyzing the Middle East and explaining how things are. She has a specific focus on countering violent extremism and is really great at it. Another one is a friend, Karma Ekmekshi. Karma has a really cool movement and initiative and brand that actually matches very well with Women to Follow, called Diplo Women, and it's all about women in the world of peace and security, and so and propping them up and giving them support and amplifying them. So she has a podcast as well that where she interviews.
Great name. Great name.
Yeah. Yep. And she and I met because she's also a SIPA alum, by the way. She and I met because she was the international affairs advisor to the Lebanese prime minister when I was handling Lebanon at the White House. And that's when we met. So these are just the 3 that I thought of off the top of my head.
Thank you.
Yeah. But I have many others as well. If I
Well, I'll be tweeting their names out, and so when I do that, you're welcome to add. And I love for the women who were named, to name 3 more, and we get
they
this,
will.
Yeah, we get this going, and very happy to hear about the Diplo woman. So
yeah.
Thank you so much, Hagar, for being with us, for being with me. You really bring so much expertise, and you make everything so clear and so dynamic. And I, really applaud you for all you're doing with your show and being a great person that's speaking out on TV and broadcast and writing in the Washington Post. Thank you so much. And if you'll just wait a minute, I'm just going to make a few announcements. And if you wait for me backstage, we'll say hello. Okay. So thank you so much, everyone, for joining me. I really learned so much today talking to Hagar, and I hope everyone else did. Always welcome to suggestions that you have for other guests. And you can find me at Rose Horowitz 31, and please subscribe to my YouTube channel. I want to talk about some other shows that are coming up with some colleagues of mine. This Sunday for the New York Times Read Along, which is a great show that everyone should watch. They're going to Neil Parrick, who joined us a little earlier. It's going to be speaking to former New York Times restaurant critic and author of Dining in the Dark, a famed restaurant critic's struggle with triumph over depression. So thank you. And my producer, Stefan Kaplan, has been putting together this new initiative from Emory University's Center for the Study of Human Health, and had a show this yesterday, and hosted by Maren McKenna. And on April 19th, we'll have a show with Emily Willingham who will be talking about her new book. So thanks everyone for joining us. Stay tuned for my next show. I have been keeping up with the news, so I've been booking it a little more quickly as things change. So keep following me, and I will put out Hagar's Woman to Follow soon. I'll see you next time. Thank you.